Hey everybody, this is the introduction and stuff at the beginning of a book titled Mao Zedong, a Political and Intellectual Portrait by Maurice Meisner. I'm reading this because I want to have, I'm kind of on this research kick where I want to explore the influence of Maoism on the new left. And I want to have some more background information about Mao than I currently do. And Maurice Meisner seems like a decent person to get that information from. I don't know. I don't really know what his politics are, but I know he wrote a book that a lot of people revere about the history of Mao's China. The sections of the book, or the chapters of the book, are Chapter 1, Youth, 1893 to 1921, Communism and Marxism, Peasant Revolution, Nationalism and Social Revolution, 1935 to 49, Mao Zedong in Power, Nationalism and Modernization, 1949 to 1950, Utopianism, the Cultural Revolution, and the Exhaustion of Maoism, Epilogue, Progress and Tyranny, Marxism and Maoism. Preface. Mao Zedong conceived and led the most popular revolution in world history. The numbers of people actively involved in the Great Revolutionary Movement that swept over the vast Chinese countryside in the late 1930s and 1940s are historically unprecedented, and the numbers whose lives were profoundly transformed by the upheaval must be counted in the hundreds of millions. In scope and scale and in its thoroughgoing character, the Chinese Communist Revolution was probably the greatest of all modern revolutions, overshadowing the French and Russian revolutions with which it is often compared. While Mao Zedong was a great revolutionary, he became increasingly despotic as a ruler, a not uncommon development in the history of revolutions. He organized the peasants of China to destroy ancient forms of oppression and authority only to replace them with the alien authority of his own deified image. He liberated the Chinese nation from the shackles of foreign imperialism and, quote, built a country, as his successor Deng Xiaoping put it, only to shackle the people of the country to the onerous demands of the doctrine of, quote, continuous revolution. The two sides of Mao, the revolutionary and the tyrant, the social liberator and the political dictator, cannot easily be reconciled, but both must be taken into account in any serious consideration of his long revolutionary career. Both Mao Zedong's successes and failures, his achievements and his crimes, enfolded on a grand scale, defining several crucial historical eras. Mao was the political leader of the long Chinese Communist Revolution for nearly 2 decades, as well as its principal theoretician and military strategist, and he reigned over the People's Republic of China for more than a quarter of a century. The duration of Mao's political dominance is unprecedented in the history of modern revolutions, providing an unusual political and ideological continuity between the revolutionary and post-revolutionary periods. This study seeks to take advantage of that continuity to explore questions relating to the social nature and limits of the Chinese Communist Revolution as revealed in Mao Zedong's long political and intellectual life. As an account of Mao Zedong's revolutionary career, this book is no more than a sketch, primarily addressed to readers who seek a short biographical introduction to the public life of an unfamiliar subject. It can be substituted by Philip Short's superb and comprehensive biography, Mao, A Life, and published in 2000, and Stuart Schramm's pioneering study, Mao Zedong of 1967, a volume which retains its vitality and historical insightfulness 4 decades after its publication. In tracing Mao's political history, this volume emphasizes his encounters with and reinterpretation of the inherited body of Marxist-Leninist theory and the relationship between his, quote, "sinified" version of Marxism and his political practice, both as a revolutionary and a ruler. This emphasis does not derive from any belief that Mao enriched the Marxist tradition. His intellectual and theoretical contributions to Marxism were meager at best. Rather, it was his departures from the basic premises of Marxism that are important for understanding both the positive and negative aspects of his political career, as will be suggested in the pages that follow. Acknowledgements. The intellectual and political portrait of Mao Zedong that is sketched on the following pages owes much to the work of many scholars who have written on the history of Chinese communism over the past 60 years. I am especially indebted to Stuart R. Schramm and the late Benjamin Schwartz, pioneers in this critical study of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution. My warmest thanks are due to Louis Knight, editorial director of Polity Press, who encouraged me to undertake this project several years ago, and to members of the Polity editorial staff in Cambridge and Oxford, especially Ellen McKinley, Emma Hutchison, and Caroline Richmond, who generously helped along the way. I'm enormously grateful to an anonymous outside reader for Polity who provided a lengthy and stimulating commentary on the original manuscript while gently pointing out glaring omissions and errors. I am above all grateful to my wife and partner, Lynn Lubkman, who read and corrected 2 drafts of the entire manuscript as well as many bits and pieces along the way. She has contributed to the writing of virtually every sentence. It is to Lynn and our son Matthew that this volume is affectionately dedicated. Notes on Chinese names. Chinese personal and place names in this volume are rendered in the now generally accepted pinyin system of romanization. These are exceptions, however. The Wade-Gillis system has been retained for Chinese names, which are most familiar to Western readers in their older form, such as Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. It has also been retained for the names of Chinese authors and book titles which were published in Wade-Gillis transliteration, usually before 1979. Thus, Mao Zedong appears as, quote, Mao Zedong, that's how it looks, Tsetung. I don't know, that doesn't matter, I'm reading out loud. In citations of the earlier Western language translations of his writings. Alright, so here we are, first chapter, Youth, 1893 to 1921. Mao Zedong was the leader of the greatest peasant uprising in world history, the architect of a unique revolutionary strategy by which the rebellious countryside conquered the cities. The revolution that grew over 2 decades in the vast rural hinterlands of China in the 1930s and 1940s was not a traditional peasant jacquerie. I don't know what that means. Rather, the Chinese Communist Revolution paradoxically was carried out under a Marxist banner, a doctrine that largely excluded peasants from any progressive role in the making of modern history. Yet, however great the incongruity between ideology and social reality, the Maoist Revolution was one of the few peasant movements in history to achieve a lasting political success, propelling Mao Zedong to supreme power in the world's most populous land, and propelled China toward that long elusive nationalist goal of, quote, wealth and power, end quote, in the modern world. Mao Zedong could not have claimed to have sprung from the impoverished and hungry peasant masses he was to organize under a communist banner. The young Mao grew to maturity in relatively comfortable circumstances. Among the 300 or so families who lived in the village of Shaoshan in the southern province of Hunan, the Mao family was one of the most prosperous. His father had fled the chronic conditions of poverty and famine under which most peasants labored by joining the imperial army at the age of 16. By virtue of thrift and no small measure of luck, he returned to his village after 6 years with sufficient money to purchase a few acres of land and to marry. By the time Mao Zedong, the first of the family's 3 sons to survive infancy, was born on December 26, 1893, his enterprising father had transformed himself into a, quote, rich peasant. He expanded his land holdings, hired 2 farm laborers, and also became a petty landlord, a money lender, and a mortgage holder. He further augmented his income by trading grain. As Mao later recalled, his father, quote, simply purchased grain from the poor farmers and then transported it to the city merchants where he got a higher price, end quote. Mao Zedong. Oh, there's end notes. God damn it. One second. You think the notes are at the end of the chapter? 199. Footnote. In late 1936, in southern Shanxi, Mao related an account of his early life to the American journalist Edgar Snow. See Edgar Snow, Red Star Over China, hereafter referred to as, quote, autobiography. and in the more critical literature, a lot is attributed to Edgar Snow and to like mystifying and kind of creating like the world cult of Mao. Anyway, that's at least as I understand it. Thus, the Mao family was rising at a time when most rural families were falling ever deeper into debt and poverty in the waning years of the Qing dynasty, the last in a long line of China's imperial regimes. It was a time when hunger chronically stalked the lands, with famines ravaging large parts of Hunan province in the 1890s and during the first decade of the new century. But amidst the deepening rural crisis, the Mao family prospered. Mao Zedong grew up in a spacious compound situated in a lovely valley surrounded by hills, ponds, and terraced rice fields. The young Mao had his own bedroom, a rare luxury in rural China. The father's financial success permitted his eldest son to acquire a traditional and later a modern Western-type education. Mao Zedong began to work on the family farm at the age of 6, but 2 years later he was enrolled in the local village school where he was taught classical Confucian texts. Mao disliked the classics, he later recalled, but he learned them well, quoting the ancient texts to his advantage in his often bitter arguments with his father as well as in later political writings and speeches. And the young Mao did acquire a love of reading, a pleasure he pursued with considerable passion throughout his life. What he most enjoyed were romantic novels telling the tales of peasant rebellions, heroic rebels, and political intrigues. Popular novels such as Romance of the Three Kingdoms, many dating from the Ming Dynasty, were beyond the pale of Confucian orthodoxy. Mao recalled, quote, "I used to read, these outlawed books, in school, covering them up with a classic when the teacher walked past. I believe that perhaps I was much influenced by such books and read at an impressionable age," end quote. Mao attended the village school for 5 years, working part-time on the family farm. He graduated in 1907 at the age of 13 and went to work full-time for his father, combining manual farm labor with the task of keeping the financial records for the various family businesses. In his spare hours, he read traditional novels and histories and also books that advocated modernization to save China from foreign colonization. Mao Zedong's iron will, which came to characterize his political career, was evident at an early age. In 1909, the 15-year-old Mao was determined to attend a middle school, the Dongshan Higher Primary School, where the Western, quote, new learning was part of the curriculum. There ensued a prolonged struggle with his father, who had arranged to apprentice his son to a rice shop in a nearby commercial town. But in the end, as was usually the case, the younger Mao had his way, and his father grudgingly agreed to pay his tuition and living expenses. He was to continue to do so for another decade. At the higher primary school located in a nearby county, Mao Zedong entered the world of China's traditional gentry elite. Less than 1% of the boys and virtually no girls were afforded a middle school education in early 20th century China. As Mao recalled his first impression at the higher primary school, the first time he had been away from home, quote, "I had never before seen so many children together. Most of them were sons of landlords wearing expensive clothes, ... Many of the richer students despised me because I usually was wearing my ragged coat and trousers," end quote. Mao in the autobiography from that he gave to Edgar Snow. Nonetheless, Mao's studies went well over the next 2 years, especially in ancient Chinese history and classical literature, and he was introduced to politics for the first time. Quote, "I made good progress at this school. The teachers liked me, especially those who taught the classics, because I wrote good essays in the classical manner. But my mind was not on the classics. I was reading 2 books sent to me by my cousin, telling of the 1898 reform movement of Kang Yu-Wei, or Yu-Wai. One was called Journal of the New People and was edited by Liang Qichao, or Liang Qichao, not sure. I read and reread these until I knew them by heart. I worshipped Kang Yu-Wai and Liang Qichao," end quote. There was nothing particularly radical about Mao's intellectual and political proclivities when he arrived in the provincial capital of Changsha in the spring of 1911 to attend a secondary school. While he had some sympathy for poor peasants at an early age, he opposed the use of illegal or violent means to remedy their plight. Mao later recalled his ambivalent attitude about hungry peasants who forcibly seized rice supplies during a severe food shortage. Quote, my father was a rice merchant and was exporting much grain to the city from our district despite the shortage. One of his consignments was seized by the poor villagers, and his wrath was boundless. I did not sympathize with him. At the same time, I thought the villagers' methods were wrong also. End quote. Mao. Autobiography. During his youth, Mao's political inclinations were no more radical than his social attitudes. His boyhood hero was the mid-19th century Hunnese statesman Zheng Gufan, a conservative Confucian who had rescued the Qing dynasty and the gentry landlord class by bloodily suppressing the Taiping Peasant Rebellion. He continued to view Zheng as a hero well into his adulthood. On the eve of the Republican Revolution of 1911, the young Mao was still a monarchist. Quote, I considered the emperor, as well as most officials, to be honest, good, and clever men. They only needed the help of Kang Yuwai reforms. End quote. Among students and young intellectuals in the waning days of the monarchy, Mao's political views were rather moderate. Indeed, quite conventional. Mao Zedong's political radicalization began at the Revolution of 1911. Those events excited political imaginations, even though the actual battles were far less weighty than they appeared to be at the time, and the end results bitterly disappointing. Mao Zedong, approaching his 18th birthday, withdrew from the secondary school in the provincial capital and enlisted in the army of a Qing dynasty commander who had defected to the revolutionaries. He spent 6 months as a soldier, largely on uneventful garrison duty in Changsha. When the last Qing emperor abdicated in February 1912, Mao assumed that the revolution had come to a successful conclusion. He resigned from the army and decided to, quote, return to my books. Following his demobilization, Mao was uncharacteristically less than fully certain about what he wanted to do. He aimlessly pursued a number of alluring advertisements for the many new, quote, modern schools that had opened in Changsha, among them a police school, a law school, and a soap-making school. He briefly attended a business school, but withdrew on discovering that most of the courses were taught in English. He then embarked on what he called a, quote, period of self-education, spending most of his time reading Western books in Chinese translation in the recently established Hunan Provincial Library. He read the authors who had molded the thought of China's new westernizing intelligentsia: Adam Smith, Darwin, Mill, Spencer, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. The young Mao was particularly influenced by the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer, with its enormous emphasis on the inevitability of struggle. In the hands of its influential Chinese translator and annotator, Yen Fu, the notion of, quote, the survival of the fittest, end quote, took on a profoundly nationalist meaning and an implicitly anti-traditionalist one. What social Darwinist text conveyed to Mao was the message that the, quote, wealth and power, end quote, of the nation was the main value to which all other values must be subordinated, not excluding traditional cultural values if need be. Although Mao was to remain emotionally attached to many aspects of the Chinese cultural heritage, traditional values were now subordinated to the higher goal of the preservation and regeneration of China as a nation-state in a world of competing nation-states. He also derived from social Darwinism a belief in the necessity and value of struggle per se, which along with powerful nationalist impulses would remain enduring features of his thought. I'm thinking about this because I don't know too much about, not like a China expert, but I took a class in college about Japan, and it seemed like Japan kind of had like a similar thing, in the sense that the nationalism that was kind of developing in the after the Meiji Restoration. For one, it was like very artificial, like the creation of like the whole emperor cult was kind of like a very recent like phenomenon, like and it was kind of like an active part of a process of like internally centralizing Japan. But there's this, as opposed to a lot of nationalism now, which is kind of like very like culturalist, I would say, or for instance like fascist nationalism, which was very kind of like about like preserving like some kind of like, you know, ostensibly traditional like folkish like culture or something like that, or just like, you know, really kind of like past oriented. and like cultural and like about like preserving traditions. That was not like something that was like in like the mind of like Japanese like state builders at the time. They were very much fine, and this is part of why they were successful. Very much thought it was necessary to take things and like implement cultural features of of like practices of other countries, say European countries, the United States, Prussia, those kind of countries, in developing their state. And so they were kind of like cosmopolitan nationalists in the sense of like borrowing excessive a lot from like Western society in terms of like implementing its own nationalist state project. And it seems like this thing that's talking about like Mao here about like subordinating of tradition to national power is something that's that has a very much a precedent. But let's see. Let's read on. Although Mao was to remain emotionally attached to I don't know if I already read this or not, so I might be repeating myself. Although Mao was to remain emotionally attached to many aspects of the Chinese cultural heritage, traditional values were now subordinated to the higher goal of the preservation and regeneration of China as a nation-state in a world of competing nation-states. He also derived from social Darwinism a belief in the necessity and value of struggle per se, which along with powerful nationalist impulses were to remain enduring features of Mao's thought. Pressed by his father to pursue a career and threatened with the loss of financial support if he did not do so, Mao eventually decided to become a teacher. He enrolled in the Hunan Provincial Fourth Normal School in Changsha, a teacher training college, in the spring of 1913. Mao remained a student for 5 years, graduating in 1918 with the equivalent of a college degree. During this period, he later recalled, quote, "My political ideas began to take shape," end quote, and, quote, "I acquired my first experiences in social action," end quote. Mao. Yet there are a few hints of Mao's future radicalism in the political ideas he expressed during these years, as late as they appear in his surviving school essays and classroom notes. His great hero remaining the conservative Confucian Zheng Guofang. Quotations from Zheng's writings appear frequently in Mao's early essays, as do passages from the text of Confucius and Mencius. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Among the great sages of world history, he listed Confucius together with Jesus and Socrates, and among contemporary political figures, he sometimes favored those who enforced, quote, order, including the brutal governor of Hunan province of 1913 to 1916, Tang Xiang Ming, who slaughtered the followers of Sun Yat-sen. New section. The New Cultural Movement. The crucial era in the radicalization of Mao Zedong, as far as for many young students and intellectuals, was the period of intellectual westernization and cultural iconoclasm known as the, quote, New Culture Movement of 1915 to 1919, the first phase in the broader May 4th movement. The New Culture Movement followed in the wake of the Revolution of 1911, or more precisely, it followed from its failure to achieve what Mao would later call its, quote, bourgeois democratic, end quote, tasks. Power in the new republic was usurped by the militarist Yuan Shikai, who drove Sun Yat-sen into exile and established a military dictatorship. The abortive democratic promise of the revolution was accompanied by failures on all other fronts. The new state was repressive but weak, incapable of bringing about genuine national unification. It prepared the way for the chaotic age of warlordism and provided no impetus for modern economic development. Nor did the 1911 revolution do anything to alleviate the foreign economic and political impingements that had turned China into a semi-colony and the, quote, sick man of Asia, end quote. With Asia's emerging, quote, westernized intelligentsia, while China's emerging, quote, westernized intelligentsia were disappointed with the failure of the revolution of 1911, they were outraged when the contemporary politicians cynically manipulated old Confucian traditions for reactionary political ends. Most prominent among such scoundrels was the militarist, quote, president of the republic himself, Yuan Shikai, who resurrected ancient imperial traditions and rituals to legitimate his dictatorial rule, proclaimed Confucianism the state religion, and eventually staged an ill-fated effort to reestablish the monarchy with himself as the first emperor of the Xin, or, quote, new dynasty. Yuan's imperial ambitions verged on parody, but it was this contemporary association of tradition with political reaction that contributed to giving the new culture movement its virulently iconoclastic thrust. The new culture movement began when China's most influential westernizing intellectual, and later the first leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Duxiu, it should also be mentioned, the leader of Chinese Trotskyism. He seems like a very interesting figure. I'd like to know more about Chen Duxiu because he was kind of like he was like a little bit older, I think. So like I think he kind of like stood more on his own feet when compared to like other like big figures within the world communist movement. And I think he kind of had a pretty I think he had a very like pretty cosmopolitan and democratic understanding of socialism. Like I think that's at least like my like understanding of Mao. I mean not Mao, Chen Duxiu. But I'd like to know more about him. I'd rather be reading a biography of him, honestly, than Mao. But unfortunately, he's less influential and less important to my purposes. Maybe the world would have been different if Chen Duxiu was the main Chinese communist everybody knew and not Mao Zedong. In the autumn of 1915, Chen found the periodical New Youth, which attracted to New Youth's editorial board China's leading Western-oriented intellectuals and molded the consciousness of an entire generation of Chinese students. The message of the New Youth conveyed to Mao's generation of students was that traditional Confucian values were not only ill-suited to China's survival in the modern world, but morally inferior to Western values as well. The persistence of old Chinese traditions was not only responsible for the plight of China, but inimical to the freedom and happiness of the individual. Thus, the urgent task confronting the Chinese intelligentsia was first to uproot the oppressive old Chinese culture and then replace it with the dynamic and liberating values of Western science and democracy. Quote, "Destruction before construction," end quote, was the motto of the New Youth group long before it became a Maoist injunction. To regenerate China, the New Youth intellectuals advocated a, quote, cultural revolution, for they believed that transforming the consciousness of the people is the essential precondition for meaningful social and political change. The effort was to be directed mainly to the youth of China, for young people were relatively uncorrupted by the traditions of the past and thus more amenable than their elders to undergo a fundamental change of consciousness. Young people were seen as the bearers of a new culture and a new society, and thus Chen Duxiu iconoclastically entitled his journal New Youth in a land where age was traditionally venerated. The intelligentsia's overwhelming concern with deficiencies in Chinese culture and morality led them at first to seemingly ignore the threat of foreign imperialism. They believed that the fundamental problems of China resided within and grave defects in Chinese culture and society. Until there was an internal, quote, cultural revolution, there was little hope of effectively responding to the foreign threat. For much the same reason, the New Youth intellectuals initially rejected active political participation. For the crisis of China was deeply rooted in basic defects in the culture and psychology of the Chinese people. Then political activity is so diseased a society offered little hope of getting to the root of the malady. What China required was a, quote, cultural revolution, and this was the first and essential precondition for meaningful political action. Neither the rather strained effort to appear unconcerned with the immediate threat of imperialism, nor the distrust of politics could survive. The dynamic events surrounding the incidents of May 4th, 1919, recast the New Youth intellectuals as the forerunners of the nationalism and political activism of the much-celebrated May 4th movement. But many of the other beliefs prominent in the writings of the New Youth group, especially the iconoclastic assault on tradition, the emphasis on consciousness as the decisive factor in history, the concept of cultural revolution, and the faith in youth, survived to mold the intellectual and political history of the modern Chinese intelligentsia. Few were more profoundly influenced by these beliefs than the young Mao Zedong. Commenting on the various activist student groups that began to emerge around 1917, Mao recalled, quote, "Most of these societies were organized more or less under the influence of New Youth," the journal, the famous magazine of the literary Renaissance, edited by Chen Duxiu. "I began to read this magazine when I was a student in the normal college and admired the articles of Hu Shi and Chen Duxiu very much. They became for a while my models, replacing Liang Qichao, I'm not sure, and Kang Ui, whom I had already discarded," end quote. Mao. Many of the, quote, culturally revolutionary, end quote, ideas Mao derived from the New Youth magazine were to influence his reception and interpretation of Marxism in the 1920s. Mao Zedong's first public article, an essay on the virtues of physical exercise, appeared in the April 1917 issue of New Youth. There is little in his unpublished writings before 1917, school essays, classroom notes, and personal letters, to suggest that he would be attracted to the radical cultural iconoclasm of Chen Dushou and the New Youth group. In these early writings, he frequently quoted Confucius, Mencius, and other traditional sages. He continued to express admiration for the conservative Confucian statesman Zheng Guofan, as well as for Confucian reformers such as Kang Youwei. The contrast with Chen Dushou and other New Youth intellectuals who believed Confucianism was the source of China's social evils and national weakness is striking. Mao's esteem for the Confucian tradition was accompanied by an authoritarian preference for, quote, law and order. In his school essay written in 1912, the earliest of his surviving writings, he contrasted the ignorance of the common people with the, quote, good laws of Shang Yang and Lord Shang, a legalist statesman of the 4th century BC whose anti-feudal reforms are credited with providing autocratic efficiency to the state of Qin. Quote, laws and regulations are instruments for procuring happiness, end quote. The young Mao wrote, but, quote, at the beginning of anything out of the ordinary, the mass of the people, bracket limin, Limin, and bracket always dislike it, end quote. Mao. This hardly foreshadows Mao's celebrated populist, quote, faith in the people, end quote. Mao's early authoritarian preferences were not confined to ancient history. He had a surprisingly favorable opinion of the military governor of Hunan province, Teng Shangming, who lived from 1886 to 1975, who was known as quote, Tang the Butcher, and even for the dictator Yuan Shikai, who had appointed Tang military governor on the grounds that they had maintained a degree of order in a chaotic age. Mao's rather benign views of autocratic rulers, from Shang Yang to Yuan Shikai, hardly accorded with the new intelligentsia's celebration of, quote, Mr. Democracy. Or at least that's what this says. I don't know. MR Democracy. Capital MR Democracy. There's no period, so I don't know. Mao's propensity to easily draw on the Confucian tradition was incongruous with the iconoclastic condemnations of Confucianism that filled the pages of the New Youth magazine. But on one crucial issue, the belief that the fundamental problem of China's plight in the modern world resided within, in deficiencies in the psychology and thought of the Chinese people, the young Mao seemed predisposed to the new culture movement diagnosis. Like the New Youth intellectuals, Mao had a profoundly nationalist concern with the foreign impingement on China, but he also believed that the cultural and moral renovation of the Chinese people was the first and essential task. This view found expression in his essay on physical education, where Mao deplored the weakness of China but attributed that condition not to foreign imperialism but rather to the deterioration of the, quote, physical condition of our people, end quote. Mao repeated a theme common in nationalist ideologies by suggesting that the strengthening of the bodies of individual citizens would eventually yield national strength. As models to emulate, he looked to the two most successful cases of, quote, late quote, conservative modernization, end quote. I don't know whose quote that is. Germany and Japan, quote, among the civilized nations of today, end quote. Mao wrote during World War I, quote, it is Germany that, bracket, physical education, and bracket, most flourishes. Fencing is spread to all corners of the country. Japan, for its part, has Bushido, end quote. Mao. Where am I? In the article, a study of physical education. Where am I? Mao was unwilling to rely solely on foreign examples of national self-strengthening. Mao suggested there was much to learn about physical education from, quote, the writings of the ancients, end quote, and he thus quoted liberally from Confucius and praised the practices of his childhood hero, Zheng Gufan, to support his prescriptions for building strong bodies that, quote, contain knowledge and house virtue, end quote. One second, sorry, I just had something I think. Sorry about that. A striking feature of Mao's essay is his emphasis on the efficacy of the human will, as if announcing one of the central features of the doctrine that was to be known as, quote, Maoism. He wrote, quote, physical education not only harmonizes the emotions, it also strengthens the will, ... The principal aim of physical education is military heroism. Such objects of military heroism as courage, dauntlessness, audacity, and perseverance are all matters of will, end quote. Mao. Yet there was little that was radical about Mao's first published essay, A Study of Physical Education, is a rather conservative nationalist message on, quote, the effectiveness of exercise in strengthening a country, end quote. There is only one faintly iconoclastic note. In an implicit criticism of the Confucian literati's traditional disdain for physical activity, symbolized by the scholar's gown and long fingernails, he wrote, quote, our country has always stressed literary accomplishment. People blush to wear short clothes. Hence, there is the common saying, quote, a good man does not become a soldier, end quote. ... Students feel the exercise is shameful, ... Flowing garments, a slow gait, a grave, calm gaze, these constitute a fine deportment, respected by society. Why should one suddenly extend an arm or expose a leg, stretch and bend down, end quote. Mao, A Study of Physical Education. The text of Mao's essay provides few clues to its author's intellectual and political future, but it must have been enormously exciting for the 23-year-old Mao, still a student at a provincial normal school, who had yet to travel beyond his native province of Hunan, to have an article published in so prestigious a journal as New Youth. Now based in Beijing, the New Youth magazine had become the principal organ of China's radical and iconoclastic intellectuals. Its editors and contributors were the most prominent members of China's westernizing intelligentsia, many of them now in the faculty of Beijing University. It was under the influence of the iconoclastic writings published in New Youth that Mao Zedong was gradually radicalized. While Mao's essay on physical education was cast in mostly traditionalist terms, by the summer of 1917 he was becoming increasingly critical of, quote, our country's ancient learning, end quote, which was the reason, he concluded, quote, why we have not made any progress even in several millennia, end quote. Very much in the New Youth spirit, Mao compared Chinese learning with Western methods and recommended the latter. Quote, today, anyone who is resolved to pursue learning and yet does not follow Western principles will not be able to attain excellence, end quote. Mao. The Western, I should say that the Western was put in brackets, so that's included by Meisner. And in a letter to a former teacher written in August 1917, Mao complained that, quote, my countrymen have accumulated many undesirable customs, their mentality is too antiquated, and their morality is extremely bad, end quote. Mao. That's from a letter to Li Jinshi. Best guess. Although Mao was increasingly influenced by the iconoclastic New Youth group, he felt the need to balance his rejection of traditional Chinese values with a critical stance toward the West. This led him to fall back on one of the most banal themes in modern Chinese and Western intellectual history, the notion of combining the best of both, quote, the East and the, quote, West. Thus, the 23-year-old Mao wrote in late 1917, I have long thought about setting up a private school which would combine the strengths of the classical education and modern schools, end quote. Mao. In reporting on the progress of an evening school, he and other students at the Changsha Normal School had established to provide educational opportunities for workers who could not afford an education and were Mao taught history. He approvingly noted that, quote, all the students lined up and bowed 3 times to the national flag and the portrait of Confucius, end quote. Mao. In a piece titled Evening School Journal, Volume 1, November 1917. Where am I? Mao's continuing attachment to aspects of the Chinese tradition and his efforts to combine what he deemed of value in the Chinese cultural heritage was, quote, Western learning, stands in striking contrast to the views of the more iconoclastic New Youth intellectuals. Hu Shi, for example, found little of value in the Chinese tradition and thus advocated, quote, all-out Westernization, quote. Even more striking is the contrast between Mao and Chen Dushou, soon to be the first leader of the Chinese Communist Party. In 1915, Chen addressed an issue that had preoccupied Chinese intellectuals for more than a decade, the desirability of blending the, quote, spiritualism of the East with the, quote, materialism of the West. It was an appealing and easy formula for intellectuals attracted to the values associated with Western economic and military power but unwilling to surrender their own cultural heritage. Chen, however, found nothing to recommend the notion. He contrasted the inertia and decadence of the, quote, East with the dynamism and youthful spirit of the, quote, West, and he found the two incompatible. Not only were Western values imperative for China's survival in the modern world, they were morally superior to old Chinese values as well, and it was fruitless to attempt to merge two starkly opposite cultures. When the West was young and vibrant, China was old and decaying, and its moribund culture had nothing to contribute to modern civilization. The only solution, Mao emphasized time and again, was to completely destroy the diseased old culture and replace it with the democratic and scientific value of the West. While Chen's condemnation of the Chinese cultural tradition may seem extreme, his iconoclastic views were shared by most members of the New Youth group. Mao Zedong, by contrast, held a far less uncompromising view of the relevance of the Chinese tradition to modern times. While he was hardly a traditionalist, indeed, his basic intellectual values were increasingly drawn from the West, Mao had a relatively sympathetic attitude toward the traditional cultural heritage, and he wished to preserve as much of tradition as seemed salvageable for modern nationalist ends. The contrast between Chen's and Mao's attitudes toward traditional culture foreshadowed the differences in their reception of Marxism at the close of the decade. Chen, the uncompromising anti-traditionalist and westernizer, was to receive Marxism as the most advanced expression of modern scientific thought, and he was to embrace it as a universally valid doctrine whose dictates applied to China as they did elsewhere. But Mao Zedong's inclination to salvage what he could of the traditional cultural heritage suggested a greater sensitivity to the particular conditions of China, and that foreshadowed a greater willingness to revise the inherited body of Marxist theory to suit those conditions. New section, the influence of Western ideas. During his final years at the normal school in Changsha, 1917 to 1918, Mao Zedong was more intensively exposed to the Western intellectual tradition than ever before. Although he never mastered a foreign language, by 1917, Chinese translations of Western writings were readily available, and Mao read widely in Western philosophy and social theory, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hobbes, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Spencer, among others. Mao's intensive study of Western writings during the 1917 to 1918 academic year was guided by his influential ethics teacher, Yang Changji, who had spent a decade studying Western philosophy in Japan, England, and Germany. A disciple of Kant, Yang hoped to combine Western philosophy with a revitalized Chinese culture, rather than replace the tradition with Western ideas in wholesale fashion, a stance that Mao found congenial. Although his aim was to reform Chinese culture, not discard it, Yang nonetheless was an ardent supporter of the iconoclastic New Youth magazine. It was Yang who had introduced Mao to that most influential of periodicals, and later to leading members of the New Youth group. Yang's ideas had inspired Mao's essay on, quote, physical education, and Yang had arranged for its publication in the journal New Youth, the magazine New Youth. And it was Yang who encouraged Mao to read Friedrich Paulson's System of Ethics, a rather banal and philosophical idealist neo-Kantian work which is to become the best known for the extensive marginal notes that Mao wrote in the copy he read during the winter of 1917 to 1918. These notes on Paulson reveal something of Mao's thought on the eve of the May 4th movement of 1919 and his conversion to Marxism in 1920. And the notes provide insights less into the reasons he was attracted to Marxism than into some of the intellectual predispositions that he was to bring to his interpretation of the doctrine. Most striking is the full-blown appearance of a powerful voluntarist strain. In the winter of 1918, it mainly took the form of emphasizing the heroic powers of individual human consciousness. Next to a passage in the text where Paulson asserts that, quote, human beings are capable of changing their basic natures by using their wills, end quote, Mao approvingly wrote, quote, the power of the will, end quote, and, quote, the power of the mind, end quote. And elsewhere Mao wrote, quote, the great actions of the hero are his own. They are the expressions of his motive power, lofty and cleansing, relying on no precedent. His force is like that of a powerful wind arising from a deep gorge, like the irresistible sexual drive for one's lover, a force that will not stop, that cannot be stopped, all obstacles dissolve before him, end quote, Mao. The annotation in the Paulson's volume also foreshadowed Mao's enormous emphasis on the value The annotations in Paulson's volume also foreshadows Mao's enormous emphasis on the value of struggle, which satisfied an essential demand of human nature. Quote, a long period of peace, would be unbearable to human life. Could human life stand the great harmony? Waves of competition and friction would inevitably break forth that would disrupt the reign of great harmony. Chaos, too, has value in real life. When we read history, we always praise the era of the warring states. It's the times when things are constantly changing and numerous men of talent are emerging that people like to read about. When they come to periods of peace, they are bored. Human nature is delighted by sudden change. End quote. Mao. The young Mao's belief that struggle, constant change, and even chaos were not only the sources of creativity but necessary to satisfy elemental human needs. His striking, if perhaps dubious, belief that, quote, human nature is delighted by sudden change, end quote, foreshadowed the emphasis on the value of ceaseless struggle that was to so profoundly mold his interpretation of Marxism. It was a belief that also foreshadowed the dystopian strain that was to appear in his later vision of the socialist utopia, the embryo of an idiosyncratic view of the communist utopia as a time of endless contradictions and struggles. The value Mao placed on struggle and ceaseless change did not rest easily with his continuing attachment to tradition. Traditionalists favor conservative continuity with the past. They are not, quote, delighted by sudden change, end quote. The Chinese tradition especially prized harmony with the social and natural worlds, not struggle to change them. Thus, it is not surprising that Mao is becoming increasingly critical of tradition in 1918. What is surprising in retrospect is that Mao's growing anti-traditionalism was expressed in a celebration of the virtues of Western-style individualism. The primacy of the individual is one of the dominant themes in Mao's commentaries on Paulson. Quote, there is no higher value than that of the individual, end quote, Mao wrote. End quote, there is no greater crime than to suppress the individual, end quote, Mao. Therefore, he demands that, quote, our country's three bonds must go, end quote. The, quote, three bonds are the essence of Confucian morality, the obedience of the minister to the prince, the son to the father, and the wife to the husband. And he further dismissed China's, quote, 2,000 years of scholarship, end quote, as little more than, quote, unthinking learning, end quote. Now, not only was the individual personality to be released from the constraints of tradition, Mao insisted that the value of the individual took precedence over the group and even the nation. At a time when Chinese nationalism was growing and would soon burst forth in the May 4th movement, Mao wrote, quote, I do not agree with the idea that the life of the individual derives from the life of the nation in the same way that the four limbs derive from the body. The life of a nation, including its politics and language, all began well after the human race had evolved, The individual came before the nation, the individual did not come from the nation, Paulson's view, that the nation is great and the individual is small, and reflects the fact that he lived in Germany, which is highly nationalistic, end quote. Mao Zedong's exaltation of the primacy of the individual marked a radical break with the Chinese tradition, which rigidly subordinated the individual to the group, family, community, or state. It was an anti-traditionalism that found its most extreme expression in his celebration of what he called the, quote, true egoism, end quote, by which he meant that, quote, the self is the center of all things and all thought, self-interest is primary for all persons, end quote. Now, Mao further declared, quote, "Some say that we must believe that moral law comes from the command of God, ... This is a slavish mentality. Why should you obey God rather than obey yourself? You are God. Is there any God other than yourself?" End quote. Mao. This extreme individualism, combined with the exaltation of struggle, marked the zenith of the young Mao's anti-traditionalism and the height of the influence of Western ideas, at least before his conversion to Marxism. The Western intellectual influences were a curious and ill-digested combination of the liberal concept of the autonomy of the individual and Nietzsche's notion of the, quote, Superman who rejects the, quote, slave morality of tradition in favor of his own will or, quote, self. Mao had read portions of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, from whom he no doubt derived his image of the hero as, quote, the truly great person, end quote, whose actions are, quote, his own, end quote, relying on, quote, no precedent, end quote. Mao attempted to soothe this radical rupture with tradition by suggesting that, quote, self-interest and, quote, egoism were compatible with, quote, our Confucian theory of ethics, end quote. But it was a feeble attempt, and although Mao was to retain an emotional attachment to aspects of the Chinese tradition, the intellectual sources that he now drew upon were mostly borrowed from the West. New section, Anarchist Influences. After his graduation from the normal school in Changsha in April 1918, the 24-year-old Mao Zedong became a leader of the new People's Study Society, one of the many radical student groups that were springing up in the various Chinese cities in the early May 4th era. The society largely devoted itself to the anarchist-inspired, quote, work-study program, which aimed to send Chinese students to France. The program championed the ideal of combining work with study, but it also had the eminently practical purpose of enabling Chinese students to finance their education by working in French factories which were suffering from labor shortages after the slaughters of World War I. Not only were there special economic opportunities in France, it was enormously believed, but a romantic image of France as the cosmopolitan homeland of modern democracy and revolution was widespread among young Chinese intellectuals, an image disseminated in the pages of the New Youth magazine by Chen Dushou and others since 1915. Mao Zedong was one of the principal organizers of the work-study movement in Hunan. Lacking firm plans following his graduation, he went to Beijing in September 1918 along with a group of 20 Hunanese students to prepare for the journey to France. But Mao did not accompany his fellow students to Europe. Mao later claimed that he remained in Beijing because, quote, I felt I did not know enough about my own country and that my time could be more profitably spent in China, end quote. Mao. Contributing to that feeling, perhaps, was a lack of funds and a reluctance to study the French language. Mao was not to set foot on foreign soil until 3 decades later, when in 1950, as leader of the newly established People's Republic, he was to journey to Moscow. Meanwhile, since Mao was no longer a student, he was no longer financially supported by his father. In searching for work, he enlisted the assistance of his former ethics teacher, Yang Changji, who recently had accepted a professorship at Beijing University. Yang wrote a letter of introduction to Li Dezhao, the head of the university library and a leading member of the new youth group, who provided Mao with a minor job as a library assistant. It was not an entirely satisfactory situation. Quote, my office was so low that people avoided me. One of my tasks was to register the names of people who came to read newspapers, but to most of them I didn't exist as a human being. I tried to begin conversations with several noted intellectuals on political and cultural subjects, but they were very busy men. They had no time to listen to an assistant librarian speaking Southern dialect. Mao. There were compensations for the intellectual slights, the menial work, and the material hardships. Although Mao remained very much on the margins of the vibrant student intellectual and political life of Beijing University, he did informally attend lectures and was a member of several student societies. He also was a frequent guest at the home of Professor Yang Shangji, whose daughter, Yang Kaihui, he married in 1921. While Mao was employed at the Beijing University Library, Li Dezhao became the first prominent Chinese intellectual to embrace the message of the Russian October Revolution. For Li, writing in late 1918, the Bolshevik victory heralded a universal wave of revolution that would shape the history of the 20th century no less profoundly than the French Revolution had influenced the course of the 19th century. Li greeted the October Revolution in a chiliastic, if not yet Marxist fashion, hailing Bolshevism as an irresistible revolutionary force about to sweep over the world. Quote, such mighty rolling tides, quote, he declared, are beyond the powers of the present capitalist, quote, beyond the present powers, quote, beyond the powers of the present capitalist governments to prevent or stop. For the mass movement of the 20th century combines the whole of mankind into one great mass. ... All those dregs of history, such as emperors, nobles, warlords, bureaucrats, militarists, and capitalists, will be destroyed as though struck by a thunderbolt. The dawn of freedom has arrived." End quote. Li Dazhou, or Li Dazhou. Mao was greatly influenced by Li's passionate response to the Russian Revolution and his image of universal revolutionary tides sweeping the world. Similar images of irresistible revolutionary waves were to appear in his own writings in 1919, but there is little evidence to support Mao's later claim that, quote, "under Li Dazhou and as assistant librarian at Peking National University, had rapidly developed towards Marxism, and Chen Dushou had been instrumental in my interest in that direction too," end quote. To be sure, Li had organized a, quote, "Marxist Research Society" at the end of 1918 that secretly met in his office. It is quite conceivable that Mao Zedong attended several of the informal discussions there. If so, Marxism made little impression on him at the time. What clearly did influence him was anarchism. Anarchist ideas brought to China by students returning from study in Tokyo and Paris have played a major role in radical Chinese intellectual life since the turn of the century. The writings of Kropotkin and Bakunin in particular are widely read. Mao Zedong was deeply impressed by Kropotkin's theory of, quote, "mutual aid" and his proposals for combining mental and manual labor. It was his anarchist ideal that inspired Mao's participation in the work-study program in Hunan in 1918. Although Mao did not accompany his friends to France, he continued to correspond with anarchist journals during his first stay in Beijing in the winter of 1918 to 1919. When Mao returned to Hunan in March 1919, his work as a labor organizer was performed largely through the anarchist associations. Mao later recalled, quote, "I read some pamphlets on anarchy and was much influenced by them. ... I often discussed anarchism and its possibilities in China. At the time, I favored many of its proposals," end quote. Mao. Many of the anarchist ideas that Mao found attractive during these years were to intermingle with an overlapping cluster of populist beliefs then being expounded by Li Dazhou, conveyed to Mao through Li's writings and possibly also through his discussion groups. This anarchist populist strain included a belief in the, quote, "advantages of backwardness," end quote, and a growing appreciation of the potential political importance of peasants' ideas which were to influence the way in which Mao was to receive and reinterpret Marxism. Footnote. On anarchist influences in the early Chinese Communist movement, see Arif Derlich's book Anarchism and the Chinese Revolution, published in 1991, and Derlich's book The Origins of Chinese Communism, published in 1989. On populist influences on Chinese Marxism, see Maurice Meisner's book Li Ta Chao and The Origins of Chinese Marxism, published in 1967. End footnote. New section, Socialism and the Advantages of Backwardness. Mao's 6-month stay in Beijing had been less than happy, partly because of the material hardships imposed by living in an expensive city on a minimal salary, partly because of his marginal place in the intellectual and political life of Beijing University. The immediate reason for his departure from the capital was word that his mother was gravely ill. He returned home, pausing along the way to bid farewell to friends who were leaving for France under the work-study program. Mao arrived in Hunan in early April, accepted a position as a history teacher in a primary school in Changsha, and plunged into a flurry of political activities. Thus he was not in Beijing on May 4th when a dramatic incident set off a rapid train of events which were to decisively transform the character of Chinese intellectual and political life. On that day in 1919, 3,000 university students demonstrated in Beijing to protest the cynical decision of the victorious Allied powers to turn over to Japan as war booty the colonial territories that had been wrested from the decaying Qing Empire by Germany. Outraged by the hypocrisy of the Western powers who proclaimed that World War I had been fought to promote democracy and national self-determination, the student demonstrations sparked a movement that signaled the birth of a modern nation. The movement quickly spread to virtually all of China's major urban centers and several dozen smaller cities as well. Students were joined by their professors and teachers, by merchant associations, and in some places by industrial workers and the urban poor. During the months of May and June, Chinese cities, which had long seemed politically inert, were caught up in a wave of demonstrations, strikes, Where the hell am I? During the months of May and June, Chinese cities, which had long seemed politically inert, were caught up in a wave of demonstrations, strikes, marches, economic boycotts, and sometimes violent clashes between protesters and the police. The massive wave of anti-imperialist nationalism that swept China in the late spring and summer of 1919 was the immediate political result of that day's uprising, but the term, quote, May 4th was soon enshrined to characterize nearly a decade of, quote, westernizing and anti-traditional cultural and intellectual transformation in the years that preceded and followed, and those who came to political and intellectual maturity during that era, including Mao Zedong, were proud to call themselves members of the illustrious, quote, May 4th generation. The demonstration and the events surrounding it brought profound changes to the intellectual and political perspectives of the new youth group. The image of a progressive West that would instruct China in the principles of modern democracy and science was shattered by the hypocritical behavior of the imperialist powers. Disillusionment with the West, in turn, eroded belief in Western liberalism, stimulating intense interest in socialism. For socialism had the great attraction of being a Western ideology, thus reaffirming the intelligentsia's westernizing inheritance and its alienation from traditional Chinese values, while at the same time it was critical of the West in its existing capitalist and imperialist form. To become a socialist in the May 4th era was a way to reject both foreign imperialism and traditional Chinese culture simultaneously. To be a modern Chinese nationalist to be a modern Chinese nationalist without falling back on old Chinese values. Mao Zedong had left Beijing 7 weeks before the demonstration of May 4th, but the powerful nationalist and anti-imperialist currents unleashed by the incident soon reached Changsha, plunging Mao into a whirlwind of political and intellectual activities. Mao founded the Yunnan United Students Association, which organized merchants and workers to boycott Japanese goods. He revived the New People's Study Society, which had become moribund after the departure of many of its leaders for France, and he planned and raised funds for a, quote, cultural bookstore to make available to Hunanese and the Western literature that had been popularized by the May 4th movement. Among Mao's notable contributions to the movement in Changsha was the founding of the Shang River Review, a weekly periodical that first appeared on July 14, 1919, and gained a measure of national attention. The, quote, manifesto in the inaugural issue featured Mao's first published response to the Russian Revolution in welcoming the, quote, great call for, quote, world revolution, end quote, and, quote, the liberation of mankind, end quote. Mao borrowed from the title imagery employed by Li Da-Shao in the article The Victory of Bolshevism. Quote, no force can stop a tide such as this, end quote, Mao declared. Quote, those who ride with the current will live, those who go against it will die, end quote. But the great tide that Mao saw sweeping the world was not socialism. In contrast to Li Da-Shao's celebrated article of 6 months earlier, neither the terms, quote, socialism nor, quote, Bolshevism appeared in Mao's, quote, manifesto. Rather, it was, quote, democracy that Mao called, quote, the basic ideology, end quote, of resistance to oppression. Moreover, he insisted that the battle for democracy must take the form of a, quote, bloodless revolution, end quote, eschewing bombs and chaos, quote. We must accept the fact that the oppressors are people, are human beings like ourselves, ... If we use oppression to overthrow oppression, ... The result will be that we still will have oppression, end quote. Mao. There was little in Mao's manifesto to suggest a receptiveness to Bolshevism, nor was there any hint of any populist celebration of, quote, the wisdom of the masses, end quote. Indeed, Mao Zedong took a rather dim view of the, quote, popular masses, end quote, whom he described as, quote, simple, untutored folk, end quote, and who are, quote, extremely parochial, end quote. Mao. Indeed, Mao repeated the iconoclastic New Youth diagnosis that the fundamental problem of China resided in grave deficiencies in traditional culture. Quote, the real danger lies in the total emptiness and rottenness of the mental universe of the entire Chinese people, ... They superstitiously believe in spirits, ghosts, and fortune-telling, and fate, and despotism. There's absolutely no recognition of the individual, of the self, of truth, end quote. Mao. That's from an article titled The Arrest and Rescue of Chen Dushou. Mao took a more sanguine view of the Chinese people in his essay titled The Great Union of the Popular Masses, published in 3 parts in Shang River Review, July 21st and 28th, August 4th. It included the first hint of the populist strain that was to loom so large in Mao's thought. In 1919, the populist impulse appeared in anarchist form. The, quote, Great Union that Mao proposed was based on the belief that the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people constitute an organic entity with great revolutionary potential. Differences among the people were not distinctions, but rather differences in occupation and social function. All that was needed was for the, quote, small democratic unions, end quote, representing workers, peasants, women, policemen, professional groups, and even chambers of commerce to spontaneously join together in a, quote, great unity to achieve liberation. The Russian Revolution vaguely provided a model for this, quote, great unity, but the Russian upheaval is not the, quote, victory of Bolshevism, as Li Dashao had proclaimed. Its real leader was the anarchist Kropotkin, who, with fellow believers in the, quote, morality of mutual aid, and, quote, Mao declared, quote, want to unite the whole globe into a single country, unite the human race into a single family, end quote. Mao was not alone in believing that the Russian Revolution was an anarchist victory, an illusion shared by many anarchists in China and elsewhere. I don't know how true that doesn't seem like that's a very true statement. I think that a lot of anarchists did support the Bolshevik Revolution, but there's always reservations about it. And also, like, there's a degree to which the Russian Revolution is a more all-encompassing thing than merely the Bolshevik coup and the defense of that coup in the Russian Civil War. It was like a popular bottom-up event that had also like a top-down dimension to it as well. Like the Russian Revolution, depends on what you're talking about, but the Russian Revolution is not just the Bolshevik Revolution, obviously. Mao was not alone in believing that the Russian Revolution was an anarchist victory, an illusion shared by many anarchists in China and elsewhere. While Mao's understanding of the October Revolution soon was to change, one anarchist populist theme announced in his article on the, quote, Great Union was to endure, a belief in, quote, the advantages of backwardness, end quote. The notion that backwardness, although a condition to be overcome, is a source of moral virtue and political vitality had been a prominent theme in the thought of Chinese intellectuals since the 1890s. China, by virtue of the very condition of its pre-capitalist backwardness, could forge its own path to socialist modernity, or the realm of, quote, great harmony, end quote, in parentheses, without repeating all the social evils associated with Western capitalism. In China, the notion of the advantages of backwardness was derived from anarchist writings, but it is an idea that in Western intellectual history most closely associated with Russian populism. The origins of the notion are to be found in the mid-19th century writings of Alexander Herzen, the ideological founder of Russian populism. Herzen believed that the advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe were too corrupted by their, quote, over-maturity to realize their own socialist ideals. It was backward Russia precisely because of the moral and social virtues inherent in its backwardness that would pioneer the socialist future by, quote, bypassing capitalism. Whether described as a, quote, populist or, quote, anarchist, his belief in the, quote, advantages of backwardness, end quote, was to become a powerful strand in Mao's thought with enormous consequences for the making of the Chinese Communist Revolution and its post-revolutionary history. The embryo of the notion appears in the final paragraph of the article, The Great Union of the Popular Masses. Quote, our Chinese people possess great inherent capacities. The more profound the oppression, the more powerful the reaction, and since this has been accumulating for a long time, it will surely burst forth quickly. The reform of the Chinese people will be more profound than that of any other people. The great union of the Chinese people will be achieved earlier than that of any other place or people. End quote. Mao's predictions that a backward China would soon leap to the forefront of modern civilization took its immediate inspiration and much of its language and imagery from the writings on the Russian Revolution by Li Dashao, published in 1918, Lee had argued that the very backwardness of Russia and China by implication contained the seeds of creative rebirth and extraordinary progress, whereas economically advanced countries such as England and France, quote, have reached a period of maturity and civilization, quote, and thus, quote, no longer have the strength to advance any further, end quote. Russia was comparatively slow in its progress and thus possessed, quote, surplus energy for development, end quote. And backward Russia's imminent revolutionary leap forward foreshadowed backward China's even more dramatic rebirth. The notion of, quote, the advantages of backwardness had great nationalist appeal, supporting the hope that an impoverished China would rapidly transform itself into a powerful and modern nation state, and both nationalism and a belief in the advantages of backwardness were involved in Mao Zedong's generally sympathetic view of Germany during and after World War I. Most new youth intellectuals look to the economically advanced Western countries, France, England, and the United States, as models of modern science and democracy, but some members of that group sympathized with Germany. Among them was Li Dazhao, who in 1916 praised Germany as a, quote, emergent nation, end quote, whereas the Allied powers were mostly nations in decline. Mao Zedong also took a generally positive view of Germany and sympathized with Germany's plight at the end of World War I. Quote, of all the peoples of the world, he wrote, quote, the spirit of the German people is richest in, quote, greatness. A spirit of, quote, greatness alone can overcome all difficulties. End quote. Mao. This is kind of like a related thing, whereas a lot of people view Germany as like a certain kind of like, it was kind of like the first almost like sort of like latecomer industrial nation, right? So it's like it's like industrialized later than say Great Britain, for instance, and it was implemented a lot of I guess to my understanding, implemented a lot of policies to like catch up, especially in the wake of the establishment of the German Empire in like 1871. I think I believe that's the year it first started, declared in Versailles. But there's a lot. This is like a general thing of like kind of like viewing like the Prussian model or like the German model of like development and like the economic nationalism of Germany and as like a model for developing nations to follow. This is a kind of a common thing, right? So a lot of places look to like Germany as like a source of as like a model for like a weaker state becoming a stronger state in the face of states that are already powerful, economically developed, and imperial and imperial. Mao sensed a certain affinity between Germany and China. Like China, Germany had been a relatively backward land in comparison to Western Europe. Mao admired Bismarck's success in unifying and rapidly modernizing a politically and fragmented backward land. And that's exactly what the Japanese state builders in the Meiji period, the Meiji bureaucrats, thought. Admired Prussian unification efforts. There's a lot of like there's a lot of degree. I mean, I don't know about the world, but I know at least I didn't know about China in this period. But I know that in Japan, like they were definitely, Germany was definitely looked at as like a model. The swift rise of Germany to wealth and power was, in a sense, a demonstration of the, quote, advantages of backwardness, end quote, and a model for China to emulate. New section, Miss Zhao's suicide. In August 1919, the warlord-controlled Hunan province government confiscated the 5th issue of the Shang River Review and banned its further publication. The journal had enjoyed a brief but influential life. Mao's writings had won a substantial readership in Changsha and drew praise from leading new youth intellectuals in Beijing, including Hu Shi, the liberal follower of John Dewey, and Li Dazhao, the convert to communism, although it survived little more than a month. Mao's provincial journal had gained him a measure of national prominence that had eluded him while he was in Beijing. After the suppression of the Xiang River Review, Mao's writings appeared in various student publications and in Changsha's leading newspaper, the Dagong Bao. He wrote articles in contemporary political and social issues, ranging from the strike-sweeping post-war Europe to the student movement in Hunan. But none were written with greater passion than the 10 articles he composed on the oppression of women published in Dagong Bao in November 1919. Among May 4th intellectuals, Mao Zedong was far from alone in advocating women's emancipation. In a movement that sought to uproot oppressive traditions, women stood out as the most persecuted victims of old customs. Many iconoclastic intellectuals of the time, mostly men, felt the need to write on what was called the, quote, woman question. But Mao Zedong's articles were unusual for their power and emotional intensity. Perhaps personal experiences were partly responsible for the passion that pervaded his essay. Mao had just emerged from a month-long period of mourning for his mother, with whom he had enjoyed a close relationship and whom he felt had been unjustly treated by his father. Mao also harbored bitter memories of his own arranged marriage, when at the age of 14 his father betrothed him to a 20-year-old woman with whom he refused to live but who remained in the family household as his father's concubine. And during the time he lived in Beijing, he had fallen in love with Yang Kai-hui, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, the daughter of his one-time ethics teacher. They were to marry unrestrained by ancient customs during the winter of 1921. The initial article was prompted by a tragedy that took place in Changsha on November 14, 1919. A 23-year-old woman whose family had arranged for her marriage as a, quote, second wife to an elderly merchant was being solitarily conveyed to her new home. When the bridal sedan chair arrived, the young woman was discovered dead, lying in a pool of blood. She had cut her throat with a razor. In the first of the 10 articles, he was to referishly write over the next 2 weeks. Mao attributed the suicide of Miss Zhao to, quote, the rottenness of the marriage system and the darkness of the social system in which there can be no independent ideas or views and freedom of choice and love, end quote. In response to an editorial writer who suggested that Miss Zhao was, quote, weak and negative, end quote, in choosing suicide rather than any other form of escape, Mao enumerated the, quote, iron nets of social convention and sexual discrimination that had entrapped her. And in reflecting on the historical reasons for the social dominance of males, Mao put a rare emphasis on economic factors, the advent of settled agriculture and a new emphasis on work with which there, quote, arrived the terrible age in which women became subjugated to men, end quote. On the, quote, women question, at least, Mao remained very much in the original May 4th spirit, lauding the social progressiveness of the West in contrast to backward China mired in ancient and barbaric traditions. Yet while Mao praised the enlightened family system of the Western countries, he attributed the oppression of women to, quote, capitalism. Quote, the slaves' work of women making tea and cooking is a result of capitalism, end quote, Mao declared. Quote, there is a tight bond between old men and capitalism, and the only good friends of love are young people, end quote, Mao. It is, of course, incongruous that Mao should have praised the capitalist West for achieving a relatively egalitarian system of gender relationships, while at the same time blaming, quote, capitalism for pre-capitalist China's sexual inequalities and generational contradictions. Mao's use of, quote, capitalism as a general term of opprobrium and a timeless evil was probably derived from the anarchist literature he was then reading, writings that tended to treat capitalism in moral rather than historical terms, and this anarchist influence contributed to Mao's reluctance, long after his conversion to Marxism, to fully accept the Marxian faith in the historical progressiveness of capitalism. In the months following the controversy over Miss Zhao's suicide, Mao Zedong's hostility to traditional Chinese culture and history, growing since the May 4th demonstration, became more intense. The young woman's chilling death had vividly illustrated the human cost of adhering to ancient social customs. Mao did not become as virulently hostile to tradition as many other new youth intellectuals, such as Lu Xun, who had dismissed the whole of Chinese history as little more than 4,000 years of cannibalism. Yet Mao had moved closer to the radical mainstream of May 4th iconoclasm and no longer refrained from sweeping condemnations of the Chinese past. On one occasion he wrote that every Chinese dynasty for 4 millennia, quote, was based on one condition alone, massive killings and bloodshed, end quote. Mao Zedong's increasing hostility to tradition was accompanied by a growing attraction to socialist ideas. For Mao, as for many Chinese intellectuals, the appeal of Western socialist doctrines was closely bound up with alienation from traditional Chinese values and opposition to the Western imperialist threat. To become a socialist was a way to satisfy both needs. Socialism, inherently iconoclastic, reinforced an intellectual's rejection of traditional culture and also reaffirmed the May 4th westernizing inheritance. But at the same time, it rejected the West in its contemporary capitalist and imperialist form. Socialism thus had enormous appeal to Chinese intellectuals in an era that was both culturally iconoclastic and nationalistic, one in which modern intellectuals assaulted old Chinese traditions and also sought to defend China against the assaults of foreign imperialism. Socialist ideas and terminology appear with increasing frequency in Mao's writings after mid-1919. Mao's interest in socialism was initially inspired by anarchism, not Marxism. The anarchist writings, which had so greatly impressed Mao while he was at Beijing, continued to fascinate Mao after his return to Changsha. Mao championed such anarchist ideals as combining work and study, integrating mental with manual labor, and Kropotkin's concept of, quote, mutual aid. Mao's bitter critiques of the Chinese family system and his articles on Miss Zhao's suicide were filled with anarchist imagery of authoritarian institutions stifling human freedom. He worked together with anarchists in organizing a Hunanese labor union in 1920. And the Cultural Book Society opened the first of its eventual 7 bookstores in September 1920. The writings of Kropotkin were among its best sellers in the autumn of 1920. The anarchist preference for, quote, federalism and small-scale organization also influenced Mao's role in the Curious movement to establish an independent, quote, Republic of Hunan in late 1920. While the Hunanese independence movement soon faded, leaving few traces, Mao's participation in the abortive venture revealed an anarchist-type antipathy to large-scale organization. Mao declared, quote, for the past 4,000 years, Chinese politics has always opted for grand outlines of large-scale projects with big methods. The result has been a country outwardly strong but inwardly weak, solid at the top but hollow at the bottom, high-sounding on the surface but senseless and corrupt underneath, end quote, Mao. And implicit in the articles Mao wrote on Hunanese independence was the belief that socio-political change could best be accomplished by moral example, a belief that Western anarchism shared with Chinese Confucianism. In the summer of 1920, when Mao was engaged in the provincial movement for Hunanese independence, Mao was also drawn, perhaps incongruously, to the internationalist message of the Russian Revolution. The impact of the October Revolution and Mao's reception of its accompanying Marxist-Leninist doctrine is considered next in Chapter 2. And it should be noted also that Marxism-Leninism as a doctrine is not the same thing as Marxism and Leninism as two distinct doctrines, right? Marxist-Leninism specifically refers to the Soviet Marxism that was developed in the Stalin period, after Stalin had come to power. Thank you so much for listening.